Charles Darwin was born 211 years ago this coming Wednesday on February 12, 1809. And in recent years, his birthday has been celebrated as International Darwin Day, an annual opportunity to celebrate the principles that guided Darwin's life, a perpetual curiosity, a scientific thinking, and a hunger for truth. These values resonate with our UU fourth principle of a free and responsible search for truth and meaning, as well as our fifth source of reason and science. A related tragedy of the ongoing, unfortunately still ongoing, creation versus evolution debate is that coming to terms with Darwin's theories of natural selection and common descent, those were really among the greatest intellectual challenges of the 19th century. But we live in the 21st century, long past the point in which the basic tenets of evolution became hugely integral to science. One reason it's significant to celebrate Darwin Day in a UU congregation is that both sides of Darwin's family were largely Unitarian. And while it's true that Darwin was also baptized in an Anglican church, he attended an Anglican boarding school and was married by an Anglican priest, it's also the case that growing up, both Charles and his siblings attended the Unitarian chapel with their mother. And the liturgy used in his wedding to Emma Wedgwood, and is there anything more Unitarian than this? That liturgy was, quote, adapted to suit the Unitarians. Some of our Unitarian and Universalist forebears were also among the earliest religious leaders to embrace the paradigm-shifting implications of Darwin's discoveries, that we humans, we are not a little lower than the angels. We are a little higher than the apes and deeply interconnected with the other animals and life forms and ecosystems of this planet. We share a common ancestor with the apes, and at the DNA level, we know that there is only a 1.23% difference between humans and chimpanzees. 1.23%. We humans, we're just not uniquely special creations. We are one among many species within the animal kingdom, and as our UU seventh principle affirms, we are called to practice a respect for the interdependent web of all existence, of which we are a part. And as brilliant as Darwin was, there's a lot of significant discoveries that have happened in the more than 100 years since his death. So in the spirit of Darwin Day, I'd like to invite us to take a brief tour of where perpetual curiosity and scientific thinking and a hunger for truth have led since Darwin's great discovery. What have scientists been doing since then? In particular, I'd like to focus on one recent and significant paradigm shift in the understandings of evolution called horizontal gene transfer. Have you even heard of horizontal gene transfer before? Okay, that's honestly more than I thought. That's impressive. Good for you. In contrast to the recent breakthroughs related to horizontal gene transfer, Darwin thought of evolution vertically. His primary metaphor was the tree of life. So at the roots, you have the simplest life forms, and then they branch up and out into increasingly complex forms of life. Indeed, the only illustration in the first edition in 1859, when Darwin's On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection came out, the only graphic was a tree of life branching up and out. For Darwin, all living beings, including we human beings, are related due to our evolution from a common ancestor, what's sometimes called common descent, which is confusing because the tree of life goes up and common descent goes down, right? I think you can figure it out though. Over time, these ascending lines of species, they could diverge, they could branch out, but those branches didn't ever converge or come back together. They just went out like trees going for sunlight. In the traditional understanding of evolution, genes only flow vertically up the tree of life from parent to offspring, but can't be traded sideways across species. But it turns out that the tree of life is more tangled than Darwin imagined, and you can start to see this on the cover of your order of service. If this sermon leaves you curious to learn more, I recommend the book, The Tangled Tree, A Radical New History of Life. And I think David Quammen, who wrote that book, uses that word radical intentionally, radical like to the root. So as we go back to the root of things, especially at that bacteria level that you're seeing on your order of service, things are really quite tangled. The New York Times named that book, The Tangled Tree, one of their top 100 books of 2018. Quammen is both a clear writer about technical topics, and he weaves a lot of fascinating stories about the scientists behind these discoveries. Now, in the spirit of full disclosure, again, we're going to get just a little bit nerdy this morning, but stick with me. I think it's going to take us to some interesting places. For instance, consider that our human cells that make up each of our bodies, those human cells evolved not only gradually in the typical Darwinian manner of gene mutation and natural selection. Our mitochondria, remember that part? And so on, that came aboard suddenly, and it came through captured bacteria. Plants acquired chloroplasts the same way. Our genomes, both plants and animals, they're mosaics. Roughly 8% of our human genome is the remnants of retroviruses that invaded our lineage, and they invaded it in a way that's like in our germline, so it's the part of our DNA that gets passed down through reproduction. So not just the bodies of our ancestors into their descendants. So we humans are at least 1/12 viral at the deepest core of our identities. So when you think about so Darwin's like the first revolution in evolution, and then the second was really Mendel, who came to understand genetics. That was like a second major revolution. This horizontal gene transfer is arguably like a third major revolution in our understandings of evolution. You could say a fourth is really coming for those of you who've been following CRISPR. The CRISPR's ability to edit not only genes, but actually our entire human genome, including what's called germline editing, which again is the parts that you pass on. So the fourth revolution is going to be human beings, for better or worse, opening Pandora's box and putting our hands in evolution that will then be passed down. But that's not the topic. I've talked about that previously. So I want to talk about that third revolution for this morning. And although understanding the origins of life is important in itself, one of the most practical reasons to better understand this phenomenon of horizontal gene transfer is that it's also a major contributing factor to the rapid evolution of antibiotic-resistant bacteria that's very much happening in our own times. The way we're like, oh, penicillin, that's going to solve everything, until we got penicillin-resistant bacteria, and then each in turn, and like MRSA, if you've heard about that in hospitals, like these superbugs. So thinking back, I honestly can't remember with certainty if I learned about horizontal gene transfer when last time I really took a biology course in the mid-1990s. It definitely wasn't a major point of emphasis, but scientists have been taking increasing note of horizontal gene transfer since about the 1980s. And the study of this phenomenon, it became a whole lot faster and a whole lot easier in the mid-1990s when we started pumping a ton of money into technology related to the Human Genome Project. Mapping our own DNA. So that made all this start going a lot faster. And since our prelude for this morning is one of many kind of animal-inspired, Darwin-related songs, the prelude in particular was about the fictional Dr. Dolittle, about whom it was said he could talk to the animals. Let me tell you, kind of in that spirit, about a real-life Dr. Dolittle, this time Dr. Fred Dolittle. He could not talk to animals. Sorry about that. Maybe he could, not that I'm aware of. But he's an evolutionary and molecular biologist and currently professor emeritus in a university in Nova Scotia. And I love this story about him that happened around 1998. The journal Science contacted him. I don't know if any of you if you're looking to kind of keep up with science, the journal Science is actually a good way that you can do that. You can subscribe to it. I don't get any kickback if you do. But the journal Science contacted him for a recommendation of, who could write an article about microbiology for our upcoming special issue on evolution. And to their surprise, he said, actually, I could do that. That wasn't the answer they were looking for, but he said, not only can I do it, but I really want to raise awareness about the underappreciated phenomenon of horizontal gene transfer that people know about if they read like Bacteria Quarterly, but maybe not if they don't. So they weren't too wild about this idea, but it would have been too rude to rescind the offer at that point. So Doolittle's article was published the next year in 1999. It was really much more of a success than he could have hoped. Suddenly, horizontal gene transfer became this much more mainstream idea in the scientific community as a result of reading his article. It was seen to be of ongoing major importance, at least in microbial evolution, something that had to be considered and discussed rather than a hallucination, an artifact, or a quirk. And keeping in mind that single illustration that Darwin had included in his first edition of Origin, Doolittle's article included another really important sketch that riffed on Darwin's Tree of Life. Doolittle called it, in a nerdy scientific way, a reticulated tree, from the verb meaning to divide or mark something in such a way as to resemble a net or a network. And that starts to sound a lot like the framework of our seventh principle, understanding our relationship to other living things as a web. Similar to the image on the cover of your order of service, Doolittle's reticulated tree not only had branches going up and out, but many connections weaving in and out horizontally, almost like a bramble or a thicket. The more scientists have dived into this new paradigm, the deeper the rabbit hole seems to go. It's kind of like those Matryoshka Russian nesting dolls. They keep taking one out and they're still like, wow, how far down does this go? How many more? So specifically, remember what I shared earlier about how it was bacteria captured early in eukaryotic cells, that's how we got mitochondria, which are super important. That's how chloroplasts got into plant cells. Well, scientists have further discovered that those pivotal bacteria had themselves been recipients of horizontal gene transfer from other kinds of bacteria before their capture. That means that, like those Russian nesting dolls, parts of genomes are within other genomes that are still part of other genomes. So that you and me, we're more like a snarl, more like a mess, more like a plate of spaghetti than some majestic tree. And so, but this intricate web of genetic influences I find compelling nonetheless. It is the case whether you like it or not, I don't know. To underscore my primary takeaway from exploring this still developing corner of science, horizontal gene transfer is really this powerful example of our seventh principle, the interdependent web of all existence. We humans we're incredible animals in so many ways, but not because we were spoken into existence a few thousand years ago, right? We didn't come from two naked Hebrew-speaking adults and a talking snake, right? That's not how it started. We're not a separate special act of creation. Thinking and acting along those lines as if we're special and can get away with everything, that's what got us into a climate catastrophe. We must learn to understand ourselves, sort of like what Jen was talking about earlier, that Joanna Macy, that bigger picture. We must learn to understand ourselves as evolving through a process that is deeply intricate, interwoven, and interdependent with other life forms and ecosystems on this planet. Evolution has often been understood as exclusively about the survival of the fittest, like Pokemon battling each other, right? In Tennyson's words, it's nature red in tooth and claw. But in the words of one scientist, more than a century after Darwin's death, we are coming to a fuller understanding of evolution, and this is a really crucial part. We're coming to understand evolution as much more about mergers and acquisitions and collaboration than about change within isolated lineages. It's not just about the divergence of branches onward and upward forever. It's about and here's another nerdy scientific word, it's about those branches inosculation. Have you ever seen trees that grow together? That's inosculation. So it's about those merging of trees. I find these scientific shifts incredible, and since microbiology and bacteria and viruses are such crucial parts of horizontal gene transfer, allow me to start to move toward my conclusion with one more story that exemplifies this kind of Darwin Day spirit of perpetual curiosity, scientific thinking, and hunger for truth. All this talk of microbiology reminded me of someone that I really hadn't thought about in decades, not since those aforementioned days of high school AP biology too. The person I'm thinking about is Antony van Leeuwenhoek. Some of you may remember that name. He was a Dutch businessman who's best remembered for being the father of microbiology. Back in the 1670s, more than 150 years before Darwin, Leeuwenhoek made his living as a draper. He owned and operated a drapery shop. And at first he began making magnifying lenses because he wanted to more accurately ascertain the thread count of his draperies. By chance, the idea occurred to him to examine other lenses under these increasingly strong magnifying lenses that he was developing to make that possible. And to his astonishment, when he took like some drain water out of the tap in various places, he discovered an abundance of tiny creatures swimming around in there. I mean, I wonder if for a moment he didn't think he was going mad, right? I mean, that's wild. He also found tiny creatures swimming around in the scrapings that he took from his own mouth, right? One of his big discoveries was someone he found who had never brushed their teeth in their life, and doing the scrapings of that. I mean, but can you imagine how shocking and disturbing that first glimpse, again, of microbiology must have been? I also love that microbiology was founded with some dude who was just trying to make sure his thread count was on point, happened to stumble backward into discovering this whole other level of reality, one that is teeming with life, that had been there all along, we just hadn't noticed yet. From that happenstance discovery, so much has flowed. We now know that the total mass of bacteria exceeds the total mass of all plants and animals on Earth. We marvel that there are more, or in horror, that there are more than 7.6 billion humans on this planet. But what about the fact that there are more than 1 billion bacteria cells in just an ounce of soil? There are more than 5 million bacteria in a teaspoon of fresh water. A single kind of marine bacteria which drifts free in the world's tropical oceans and photosynthesizes like a plant, that may actually be the single most abundant form of life on this planet. One source places its standing population of that one type of bacteria at 3 octillion. That's a 3 followed by 27 zeros. If you really want to be kind of disturbed about the world, talk to microbiologists. They will share with you some really troubling things. And with the discovery of horizontal gene transfer, we're increasingly aware of how all those teeming hordes of bacteria are much more deeply woven into ourselves than we could have previously imagined. Our awareness of this micro aspect of our reality came from an individual closely observing how the world actually is, which is often quite different than we have been told. Darwin did likewise. He was a naturalist who spent incredible amounts of time tracing and logging and comparing various forms of life, discovering what forms of life are actually out there and how they might have evolved and related to each other, far beyond what had been previously known. The philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein used to say it this way: don't think, look and see. Don't think, look and see. You might be surprised what you notice. So continuing in the Darwin Day spirit of perpetual curiosity and scientific thinking and the hunger for truth, I'll conclude with the final paragraph of Darwin's 1859 book on the origin of species, where as many scientific texts are, I guess I can say this out loud, not well written, and become obsolete after new discoveries are made, Darwin's books have been widely praised for both the beauty of his prose as well as for being well worth revisiting more than 150 years after his death. So I invite you to consider anew these words from the conclusion to origin. Note that Darwin begins by naming aspects of life that we often consider solely negative, and then shows how those very things are essential to the engine of evolution. In Darwin's words, from the war of nature, from famine, from death. Those are negative things, right? The war of nature, famine, and death. From those things, the most exalted object that we are capable of conceiving, not God, but the higher production of animals, right? That for Darwin was the most exalted object that we are capable of conceiving. From those things, the production of higher animals directly flows. He then adds that most famous line from Origin: there is a grandeur in this form of life. So many people first heard of evolution and thought that's insulting that I'm descended from apes or whatever, right? Darwin's like, no, there is a grandeur in this view of life. And whilst this planet has gone cycling on according to the fixed law of gravity, from so simple a beginning, right? So simple a beginning, these simple RNA, becoming prokaryotic, becoming eukaryotic, and then mitochondria. So from so simple a beginning, endless forms, most beautiful and most wonderful, have been and are being evolved. As we continue to navigate our way through the promises and perils of embracing both the best of science and spirituality, of reason and religion in the 21st century, I invite you to rise and embody your spirit. In your gray hymnals, turn to hymn 343. We'll sing a hymn written out of this very struggle.